flights to catch, getting out of town for break and all of those kind of things. So we want to honor your time. My name is Joseph Jordan. I'm director of the Stone Center, and I'm happy once again to be here in collaboration with the Bull's Head Bookstore, which has been a very, very strong partner of ours in presenting these very important scholars and bringing them here to the university, and also giving you an opportunity to interact with them and to buy their books. This is the second program for this year. I also want to mention that the next program is taking place on March 22nd, a couple of days after you return from break, with David Garcia. Many of you know who's an associate professor here in ethnomusicology, and he's going to be discussing Listening for Africa, Freedom, Modernity, and the Logic of Black Music's African Origin, which is really a very interesting study of some of the work that comes from Damaso Perez Prado. So we hope you'll be able to join us for that as well. But today we also have a very, very interesting and important guest. I neglected to mention that Women's Studies is also co-sponsored with us for this particular program. I was discussing with Marisa before we began that she came to my attention through the good friendship of Elise Crystal, who told me after we had had a study group meeting that there was this author that I had to bring. And I said, well, we'll think about it. She says, no, you have to bring her. And I said, well, okay. And then when I mentioned it to Tanya Shields, she jumped. How many of you all are her students? Have you ever seen her jump this high? She jumped this high when I mentioned that we were going to be bringing her. And I'm very happy that they brought her to my attention. Again, in the world of the internet and the web and all of these little things we do with our thumbs, I'd heard the name, I'd seen things about her work, but hadn't focused on it. But I'm so glad that she is here with us now and is now part of the family. Marisa J Fuentes is Associate Professor of Women and Gender Study and History and Presidential Term Chair in African American History at Rutgers University. Her scholarship brings together critical historiography, historical geography, and Black feminist theory to examine gender, sexuality, and slavery in the early modern Atlantic world. She teaches courses in history and women and gender studies on topics ranging from the early modern Caribbean history and women's and gender history in the United States to feminist theories and methodologies. She co-directs the Black Bodies Project at the Rutgers Center for Historical Analysis, a weekly seminar that seeks to attend to and address Black embodiment with a particular focus on the many ways in which Black bodies have been subject to epistemic, historical, archival, and biopolitical practices of violence and erasure in various times, spaces, and geographies. Excuse me. Her book, Dispossessed Lives, Enslaved Women, Violence, and the Archive, will be the subject of her talk today. This book won both the Barbara T. Christian Best Humanities Book Prize and the Berkshire's Conference of Women's Historians First Book Prize. The text illuminates the lives of enslaved women in 18th century Bridgetown, Barbados, by reading fragments of traditional archival materials against the biased grain. We're going to ask her to come up and talk a little bit about the text. I'm not sure if you're going to do readings from it, but we have a PowerPoint. As you know, PowerPoint makes you complete. And so that will help us get a little bit more into it. And I know that she's going to leave some time for us to interact with her and to ask questions. So please, please help me welcome Marisa Fuentes.
To thank, actually. What an honor to be here. Thank you all for coming. I wanted to thank Elise for instigating this visit, and obviously Sharif and the Stone Center, Director Joseph Jordan, and the staff for bringing me, and also for the support of the Women's and Gender Studies Department. Women's Studies? Women's and Gender. Hey! Hey!
Moving on up.
Yeah. I was here 10 years ago as a postdoc. It's been 10 years. It's amazing, in Women's and Gender Studies. So it's a wonderful homecoming and a pleasure to be back here and be in conversation with the UNC community, and also shout out to Professor Shields' class, Plantation Lullabies. Thank you for coming. I wanted to begin by very briefly, wait, before I begin. And thank you for dear friends that showed up today, some of whom I haven't seen for years. I'm so glad you came. Okay. So I want to begin by very briefly setting up the book and providing a little background as to how I came to this project. But because the book is predominantly about method and how to approach archives of slavery, I think it would actually better serve the audience if I read 2 short excerpts from the book, because it demonstrates what particular experiences as a researcher led me to write the book in a kind of unconventional way, and how specific techniques of writing can be used to produce ethical historical work when attending to the lives of vulnerable historical subjects. And there will be plenty of time for discussion. I'm happy to sign books as well. And I'm very excited because this is the first time I've seen the paperback in print, so this is wonderful. So my original dissertation work was actually a comparative study of enslaved women in Charleston, South Carolina, and Bridgetown, Barbados in the 18th century. And I chose those sites because of an unusually large number of women, enslaved women in each place. And I thought about how to tell a story of slavery if the demographic and our attention is on enslaved women. So my interest in these 2 locations started from work I did originally in South Carolina in a later period when I was an undergrad and doing senior thesis research in the Sea Islands of South Carolina. And then when I pursued graduate work, I wanted to do something diasporic, meaning I wanted to kind of bridge the United States with other parts of the African diaspora. So I read back and I read back and I read back into South Carolina history and realized very quickly that Barbados is the origin of the Carolinas. Barbadian planters colonized the Carolinas in 1670. So that then brought me to do research on Barbados. I was always interested in the study of gender and slavery, and although Charleston actually fell out of the book when I was reconceptualizing it, and it focuses solely on Bridgetown, I was able to consider several aspects of enslaved women's lives at the same time as what it meant to be enslaved in a town. So this is a focus on urban slavery, but also in the midst of a sugar revolution and a sugar economy, and within a system of ubiquitous violence. And the violence that marked enslaved women's bodies in life and death, I argue, left them distorted in the archives that we are forced to use in order to reconstruct meaningful knowledge about their day-to-day realities. So I wanted to read 2 excerpts from the book. The first is the beginning of the last chapter, so chapter 5, entitled Venus, Abolition, Discourse, Gendered Violence, and the Archive. And I'll finish with reading most of the epilogue, which is short. These pieces, I think, frame and exemplify the work that the book does, and will hopefully pique your interest and generate questions and comments. And I'm looking forward to that discussion. In 1780 or 1781, a young, unnamed enslaved woman, about 19 years old, chained to the floor inside her owner's tippling house near the square in Bridgetown, cried out so loudly she could be heard from a considerable distance. Exhausted, bleeding, and near death, she struggled with the consciousness after 3 separate beatings each 39 lashes with the cowskin whip wielded by her owner. It was the sound of her straining voice, quote, the most dreadful cries that could come from a human being, end quote, and the sharp noise of the whip hitting her body that brought Captain Cook and Major Fitch of the 90th Regiment inside the tavern to witness an attempt to stop her punishment. This is actually the original archival text. She heard them demand entrance. She felt blows on her body grow stronger. The door broke open. The men entered with hands on their swords. Her owner jumped behind the counter and an argument ensued. She heard her owner defend himself with the law. Only 39 lashes at a time. 39 more lashes are due before daybreak. It was within the law. Sometime between 1761 and 1782, another unnamed enslaved woman struggled to still her swinging body as she hung from her wrists from the branches of a tree in a yard in Savannah Lamar, a coastal town in Jamaica. Her toes, quote, just touched the ground. She screamed loudly, echoing her torture through the streets, though she was not being whipped, as was a common punishment for the enslaved. Her screams intensified when she swung forward, making contact with the fire at the end of the stick held by her owner. He was burning her, quote, private parts in the intervals of her pendulum movement. As she shrunk from the burning stick, her momentum only, quote, returned her to her former position when she again met the fire and so repeatedly swung to and fro, end quote. Drawn to the scene by, quote, the sound of her cries, Mr. Ross Esquire yelled out to her master to desist in this activity. And she watched as the stranger threw rocks at him over the fence, quote, which he believed had the effect of stopping the punishment. Ross was mortified by the horrid cruelty and related the story around town. It was received with universal detestation as, quote, the perpetrator was by no means a man of character or reputation. Henry Hugh Dalrymple was among 100 or more white men examined by the House Committee appointed to examine witnesses on the slave trade and slavery in the West Indies between 1788 and 1792. Dalrymple served as a lieutenant in the 75th Regiment in garrison at Gorée Island, present-day Senegal, during the American War for Independence. He would be appointed, then asked to resign as governor of the initial Sierra Leone settlement, to which the British sent over 1,100 freed blacks relocated from settlements in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. Some would consider him an abolitionist. He once owned and sold a plantation in Grenada. The committee asked Dalrymple, quote, were Negro slaves during your residence in the West Indies considered as being, and as having always been, under the protection of law? He replied, I do not believe they were considered as under the protection of law. In June last, 1789, in the town of St. George in Grenada, I saw a negress who was brought there to have her fingers cut off. This girl had committed a fault and had run away to avoid punishment. After being absent 2 days, she was brought to her master, who suspended her by the hands, and in that situation she was flogged in so cruel a manner that her back, breast, belly, and thighs were cut in many places. She was left suspended by the hands till her fingers mortified. This happened several months after the new act for the protection of slaves was passed. I saw a negress who had no teeth, though a young woman, and she informed me that her mistress had with her own hands pulled out her teeth, and besides given her a severe flogging, the marks of which she bore upon her body at the time, though she had been flogged 3 years before. These accounts of unnamed women being whipped, burned, and brutalized embody the conditions of urban slavery, of public visibility and vulnerability, sexual violation, alleged criminality, troubled agency, and death, all of which have been considered in the previous chapters. The specificity of urban space and slavery led to both domestic intimacy with white owners and a public spectacle of torture using techniques of punishment distinct to port towns. Everyday acts of violence on enslaved women also included sexualized punishments though they were rarely archivally documented, and even more rarely through the voice of the victim. The supposition that these women were guilty of a crime permeates the witnesses' accounts, however shocked they are by the horrid cruelty. It is possible that some of the women died from their wounds, but their fate remains impossible to document. Instead, these 4 unnameable women become visible through violence, and this is the state in which they remain in history. How, as Saidiya Hartman asks, does one recuperate lives entangled with and impossible to differentiate from the terrible utterances that condemn them to death? How do we write a history of the voiceless and the violated? There are questions that cannot be answered. Would the women have someone to attend their wounds? Would they be attended to at all? How does a slave acquire food to eat because she has no teeth? How was a woman treated by those expecting labor when she had no fingers? How do the women remember or carry the pain inflicted upon them? Did the young woman chained to the floor die? Who would bury her? The woman terrorized with burning. How does one attend her wounds without further violation? These brief glimpses of tortured, enslaved women emerge only where authority is enacted, claimed, and life taken away. They come to us through encounters with power. If any of these women survived such brutality, they would have had to continue living with the men and women who abused them or be sold to strangers. They were property. There will always be an inadequacy in their accounting. To the epilogue. In writing this epilogue, I want to return to the beginning, to the roots of my methodological and ethical concerns, and underscore what it means to reckon with the tragic permanency of historical erasure and silence. There will always be unanswerable questions from an archive that cannot fully redress the loss of historical perspectives and the insights from the enslaved. I went to Barbados searching for something I would never find. Emerging empty-handed from these archives, the silence deafening, I was confronted head-on with the questions this book has attempted to answer. I had intended to write about the ways enslaved women labored, built communities, and experienced the confinements of urban life. Yet nothing prepared me for the encounter with the paucity of material about enslaved women, the complete absence of material by enslaved women, and the intensity of archival and physical violence on enslaved women that I would struggle with for over the next decade. There were none of the voices I sought to document. No whole figures emerged that I could trace beyond a momentary mention. The women I did find were battered, beaten, executed, and overtly sexualized. They were listed on estate inventories only as Phoebe, Mimba, or Broken Back Betty, and sometimes only as Negro, stripped bare of all that was meaningful in their lives. Bequeathed in wills and deeds, or counted in dying on slave ships, they could not tell me about these conditions or what they thought, how they loved, or from where they came. The permanent loss of this knowledge was harrowing. Looking back now, I understand how both naive and hopeful I was going into this project. I believe I would find that one source no one else had yet discovered. I would be able to tell a story from the standpoints and thoughts of the women about whom I wished to write. I would discover a document that revealed the inner everyday lives of the enslaved in plain language that I could simply translate. I encountered images of Rachel Pringle Polgreen across the island made into dolls, posters, and postcards, her caricature recommodified for 21st century tourists. I scoured a century of execution compensation records and read about Molly and numbers of other women who had been executed, and I found the condition of their lives buried with them. There was nothing about age, family life, or the circumstances leading to their convictions. I could not prove at the time what I felt to be true. The system of slavery assumed enslaved people were criminals, when they were instead victims of an impossible legal structure. I discovered a court case where an enslaved boy dressed in women's clothes with a hidden dagger walked across town at night, dragged into the affairs of white Barbadians, yet silenced within the frame of law. Not even his name was mentioned. The few surviving newspapers contained brief advertisements of runaway slaves. One of them was Jane, conjured by the variety of scars on her body. Her owner mentioned no relatives or considered her life she left behind when she was captured and brought across the Atlantic. I was drawn to each of these people by the loss of their histories and my unfulfillable desire to recuperate something about them. I found only their archival mention, fragment, or image, and knew something must be said. At the time of their discovery, I did not yet know what they embodied, only that they represented a range of theoretical concerns I began to ponder because of their incomplete and violated nature. My questions shaped the way I would seek to bring these women into history, as well as a way to bring the discipline of history into a more transparent and reflexive frame. It was the context and manner in which enslaved women were silenced that provoked my focus on addressing this process of erasure and the violence of their physical, historical, and archival condition. After 22 months of archival research in Barbados, England, and South Carolina, I returned to the United States with a determination to address the issue and causes of archival silence. Through the life of this project, I worked within a historical disciplinary structure that required more sources to make the project viable, and within the logic of historical methodology, which purported that a history of silence could not be written, when there was not enough material to fill an article, let alone a book. I resolutely thought about and challenged the process from which these disciplining rules and desires emanated. The women in the book, Jane, Agatha, Rachel, Joanna, Molly, and the many more whose names did not survive, required more than the limits of a single discipline allowed. And I spent the next several years developing methodological pathways into their lives. These included explorations about their historical or historiographical representations, thinking through the theoretical significance of colonial power in the realm of law and punishment, and changing the archival language and gaze to reflect the gaze and perspective of the women in the fragments. History is produced from what the archive offers. It is the historian's job to substantiate all of the pieces with more archival evidence, context, historiography, and put them together in a coherent narrative form. The challenge this book has confronted is to write a history about what an archive does not offer. My questions guided me to move towards particular methods that would assist me in explicating the limits and possibilities of enslaved women's historical subjectivities. Molly, for example, symbolizes both the violence of slavery on bodies and the violence of the laws that prevent the enslaved from claims of humanity and innocence. Rachel Polgreen's meta-narrative demonstrates the troubling and silencing nature of historical production. It shows the way her rehearsed narrative obscures her perpetuation of slavery's violence. Jane and the unnamed woman in the final chapter illuminate the manner in which mutilation, physical and symbolic, conditioned their historicity, leading to questions about the impossibility of recovery. The nature of the archive from which they emerge requires this effort. We cannot redeem or rescue them, but we can consider their pain. This project has not been without risk for me and perhaps for my readers as well. It is not hewn to those historical practices that require a vast empirical base from which to generalize. There is political risk in presenting seemingly defeated and disfigured subjects and presenting too much death and violence. And there is risk in the archival encounter. Confronting sources that show only terror and violence are a danger to the researcher who sees her own ancestors in these accounts. To sit with these sources requires the capacity to hold and inhabit deep wells of pain and horror. One must persist for years in this mortuary of records to bring otherwise invisible lives to historical representation in a way that challenges the reproduction of invisibility and commodification. This process of historicization demands strategies to manage the emotional response one has to such brutality in order to persist with these subjects, to be willing to take up and sit with this aspect of human degradation, and to find meaning. When writing chapter 5, I spent weeks reading hundreds of accounts of dismembered, burned, and whipped enslaved women and men. There were many times I had to put the documents down and walk away, but I knew I had to gather myself and return to them. I have by now spent years absorbing the brutalizations inflicted on people of African descent and witnessing the process by which humans cease to be. To spend time in this temporal and geographical space is to risk emotional strength. It obliterates the possibility of objectivity. It is an exercise of endurance. Dispossessed Lives insists that historical studies of the Black Atlantic inform the ways in which race, gender, and sexuality continue to shape the lives of African-descended people worldwide. It is a history of how people of African descent became disposable, when Black lives were objectified and thus vulnerable to the caprice, lusts, and economic desires of colonial authorities. It documents the strategies and structures that made Black Atlantic lives subject to the violence of thought and action. It offers material to reflect on the stakes of resistance in such systems and the reproduction of race and gendered configurations of vulnerability. It begins to mark the way that the archive and history have erased Black bodies and how the legacies of slavery, the racialized sexism, and the legal, socioeconomic, and physical violence against people of African descent manifest in the violence we continue to confront. It is a gesture toward a reckoning of our own time. It is a history of our present. Thank you. I wanted to leave plenty of time for discussion because of the kind of intensity of the material and questions about any part of the book. So I'll give you a minute to kind of breathe and then open to questions and comments. Before I start calling on people.
Just gonna say, I'm so eager to read your book and share it with others.
Thank you.
So many questions that come up in work and struggles with historical archives. And that comes from literature, and teaches us field of literature. And it occurred to me, listening to you, that history is hard on its scholars and on all of us. Whereas in literature, we can look at those archives that you described and link them to what you said at the end. This history is our present. We can look to people like Rita Dove writing a poem unaccustomed, bringing those voices alive in ways that historians never can. And I was just wanted to ask if you could follow up on to what extent you turn to other disciplines to help you here, because of the restrictions, it seems to me, that history, the constraints that history puts on this kind of project.
That's excellent. Thank you for that. Because it's the heart of the project. I think with what I'm saying in the epilogue is that I refused the limits of history, right? I refused the methods because it, I think, produced another kind of violence. To buy into methods that require large empirical data, right? Ignores the fact that the very people who were experiencing most of the violence are not going to leave a record behind. So I did reach out to as many kind of different disciplines and disciplinary techniques as possible. And you bring up a really interesting point that people often talk about when we get in a forum between literary scholars and historians, and what's the difference. I think all history, and Hayden White just passed recently, so I mean, I think all history is a production, and historians need to recognize it's not a science, because we're crafting narratives as we do craft fictional work. But one thing I was very careful to do, because I do want to change the way that we encounter the archive. I do want to change the way that we do history and the field of history. So I was very careful. I used literary techniques, the way that I would write from the inside out of a scene, in contrast to the way that the white men described it, right? To change your feeling when you encountered the text, which I think is a literary technique. I read a lot of literature, right? We all do. But I was very careful to not write fiction. And I did that very, very purposefully. I think one of the, not to me, but to many historians, to be accused of writing fiction is a huge problem. But I wanted to show the most empiricist historians that what I was doing was not writing fiction. In fact, everything that I've done was in the realm of possibility. I use other kinds of sources to give context and to fill out one's life. So I was trying to show them that you just need to be more expansive with the archive, particularly with vulnerable historical subjects, because we owe it to them.
I ask folks that are asking questions, can you stand, please, because you all hear. I don't think they've heard any of the question in the back.
Or if you could repeat the question.
Yeah.
Okay.
That would be really good.
Okay.
But standing also because we're videotaping as well. Thank you.
Tanya.
All right, so my question is actually, you talked about this work actually began as an undergraduate, like your senior thesis or your undergraduate thesis. Can you give us a sense of your journey in relationship to the archive? So when you first started as an undergraduate, what the archive looked to you then as a graduate student, now as a professional, where you're challenging what the archives gives and how you were interpreting that. Can you give us a sense?
Sure.
Because the students here have been to the archive, and I think it might be interesting for them to hear about your journey.
Sure, thank you. Did everybody hear the question? So the journey from undergrad to standing now. I'll try to keep it brief, but you know, to be honest, I was trained, had a BA in American history. And the institution that I went to didn't actually have African American history. So, and that's what I really wanted to do. So I had to take classes in all kinds of disciplines, sociology, literature, I'm trying to remember what else. I did study abroad as well. So by the time I finished, I had an interdisciplinary degree, whether or not it was called that, right? But I had this amazing mentor in Professor David Anthony in undergrad, who said, you're interested in this history, you're interested in slavery, you just spent a year in Ghana, go to the Sea Islands, drive your little car out there, and spend the summer by myself, pretty much, but not just by myself. And I didn't know what I was doing. I did not know what I was doing. And that means that I went to the archives and I did not know what to write down. What was I supposed to be doing in here? So I would write things that sounded interesting, and I'm not sure that my thesis turned out the way that I wanted it to. But at that point I was a very traditional historian, and that's what I want. I wanted the truth, because I felt like I hadn't been exposed to the truth until I got to college. And then I felt robbed that no one had told me all these things right before. So when I went to graduate school, I purposely went into an interdisciplinary program. I found that as I got further from my undergrad, the history programs, even the program, I took one class at Berkeley in the history department and I dropped it because I was so profoundly disturbed that the students were saying, oh, but this is an objective science, like this is, and I was like, it's like not what we're talking about in African American studies at all. So it changed me. And I had I've just been really, 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 really lucky with mentors. I had Saidiya Hartman, who was a literary scholar, and Eula Taylor, who's a historian, on chairing my dissertation. So they got along, they're like best friends, so that's really good. So that they worked very well with each other. And Saidiya's classes allowed me to think in ways very expansively, introduced me to theory, archival theory, Truyo, and all of these texts that really, really changed the way that I thought, but also changed the way that I thought truth was made. And also started really understanding that the work we do affects everybody, right? It's history does work. So I took all of that, and I will say that I'm stubborn and determined. I'm stubborn. Because I had to make sense of this dissertation for the market and the field. And so here I am, pretending to be a historian, applying to history jobs, and surprisingly I got one. But I will say that since I started my tenure track, there was pushback. I think that there's still pushback in the field. There's people that are really disturbed by any kind of interpretive, creative endeavor with the archive. The archive is verbatim, right, for them. And so it wasn't easy. And to be honest, I was told pretty late in the process of getting the book to the press that by a senior British historian colleague who was going to vote on my tenure, that it seemed that I was concerned with ethical problems and that historians didn't do that. And that I should instead write a play or a novel. So, you know what, I mean, I think this is the power of having mentors who told me, write the book you want to write, because it's the book that you're going to live with for the rest of your life. No one else is. And they said, you know, and if you don't get tenure, you will get tenure somewhere else, right? Persist in what you feel you want to do. And I think that is, I was taught to be brave. I got through the kind of pushback, and it seems to have paid off with my colleagues who now realize that there's other people in the field who actually think that this is an important contribution, and so they're now on board with it. But yeah, long journey.
Thank you so much. This is really wonderful. And I'm sure you're an inspiration to a lot of people in the field and coming into the field. It's great that the students get to hear you too. My question is, I'd be interested to know your assessment of the representations of slavery and women, enslaved women, in culture and in popular culture, because there's been a proliferation. I've been watching this series, Underground.
Oh yes,
on
that
TV.
has been canceled.
Yes, it's kind of amazing,
Yeah.
and it was canceled after the second season. And it does focus a lot on women and the leadership of women and escaping from slavery, and kind of using that as one example, but anything that you care to talk about. I wondered, how much of these representations do you see really as fiction? And in that sense, do you think they're helpful or not? Or how much on a continuation of and mixture of history and fiction?
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks for that question. And I think that there's certainly many, many representations of enslaved women in popular culture drawn from historical figures and people that were people that had an enslaved experience, that ran away, that resisted, that, I mean, I think they take the pop culture representations from general experiences of enslaved women with sexual violence, and with, particularly, there's a lot of representation of enslaved women and white men in the popular culture. So these are drawn from real experiences enslaved women had. They had no right over their body, right? So that was inevitably part of the enslaved experience, and certainly the underground represents that. I mean, I think what troubles me is that, both on the kind of historian side, but also as we get kind of wrapped up in some of these, is that many of us search for a kind of romance, whether it's heroism or love conquers all. And that's troubling because it belies the complexity of people's choices and the difficulty of making choices when you weren't free at all, right? And I think one of the most popular culture images is Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, which is, she seems to represent the every woman in enslavement. And that's, it's been really controversial with the family and with historical representations. Now, you put underground in my head. I mean, I think what is so wonderful about that particular show, and for those of you who haven't seen it, it's 2 seasons, of a group of enslaved people that run away from a Louisiana plantation, Georgia, and it's kind of around this couple, right, this enslaved who are in tension with each other and in love with each other. One of the things that show does really well, I think, is her mother, right? The mother of this runaway woman is mixed race, is involved with the owner, her owner, has children by him. And as she did things to protect her children, and on the outside in the archive, right? If you just had the archive, you would read it and say, oh, she must have loved him. But that's what the archive, you don't have her perspective. That's the tragedy of it. When in actuality, it's much more complicated, right? And it's human dynamics. And it's human dynamics in very stressful situations, in situations of the threat of violence or death. What kinds of decisions do you make in that? They're not all heroic, and they don't often make sense, and they're contradictory. And so I really appreciate that they're trying to get that, or at that aspect of that particular program. And I'm also thinking one of my absolute favorites that I was reading several times when I was writing this book is Marlon James' The Book of Night Women, which is a novel set in Jamaica at the turn of the 19th century, but 18th, 19th century, and it's around these women who are on this plantation and kind of organize a revolt. And it's the actual, it's the most proximate to what I understand the experience of enslavement was for women in the Caribbean. So it was just, there are people writing fiction who get it right. And that book in particular, you read it, it's so well researched. He was in the archive. So, I really appreciated that work. I think people need to do research, right? To kind of push back on some of these fictional or symbolic figures.
I'm actually studying for a master's in information science and archives.
Wonderful.
So my question is, what can we do to help? What sort of remedies, if any, do you see that archives can offer, to help with particularly vulnerable lives? You're sort of finding records that just aren't there.
Right.
Yeah, what can we do to help?
That's a great question, because for the first time in my career, I've been invited to give a talk for a group, Rare Books and Manuscripts, which I was like, what can I possibly say? But then I realized that there's critical conversations around archival preservation, around exhibits of manuscripts and museums, and that perhaps a kind of ethical conversation around conservation would be important to the group of people, right? The librarians and archivists. I mean, I think some basic things is to understand that Whenever we are thinking about the archive, we're always thinking about who is being represented and who is not. And although enslaved people, perhaps, I'll use them as an example, are not going to be represented in the ways we want them to, there are records that are worth preserving that give us a glimpse of them. And to make sure that those records are preserved alongside. So Thomas Jefferson is my punching bag. I bring him up every time I give a talk, but because he represents someone who's so prolific, right? We have all of these records of him. We have all of his thoughts and feelings and writings, and but we don't often take a critical stance against what he's saying and what he's writing and representing. And I think about that in particular in the days and age of Facebook and social media, that we don't represent ourselves fully on those things. We curate ourselves we curate. I'm not on Facebook anymore because of the curation. But what makes us think that this man wasn't aware of how he was representing himself, right? So I'm critical of colonial archives, right? And archives that are produced by slave owners and the like. But I also think that we can use these techniques to push back on the archives we do have, and to encourage a different kind of interpretation of them. So it's really figuring out what collections are worth preserving. But then you have to think, I think, broadly, where are these archives? And who has the resources to preserve them? Certainly the work that I did in Barbados, and they have resources, and it was a great archive. But at the same time, I was still opening books that disintegrated as I opened them, right? So it's about partnering with big institutions like the National Archives in London, and have a lot of grant programs to get into, so that you partner with an archive, a repository that doesn't have those resources, and you digitize things, and you work with them, and they tell you what they want you to digitize. So I think that there's ways to really think broadly and to be collaborative and to listen to people who are from places that are vulnerable, right, to weather and economic development.
As one who knows nothing about archives, about history, about any of it, I want to go back to your colleague who made the comment to you that you should be writing a play or a novel. I'm not understanding at all what his problem was with what you found and what you reported as the history of that whole event. I'm lost.
Okay, yeah. No, it's a great, actually it was this chapter that I shared with that group. I wasn't reading the archive the way that he wanted me to read it, I guess. Because I changed the perspective of the document. Because that's the document, right? And I changed the perspective of it. I don't know, I mean, there's a lot of things that he had a problem with. I think partly it's the disbelief that there's something particular about enslavement and violence. Because some of his comments were about, well, at the same time in London, Europeans and poor people were subject to violence and whippings. And so what's so unique about this, right? But it was also my method, I was imagining someone looking out. And what I was doing was writing in a negative space. Her voice is not here. You don't even hear her. Although this chapter is actually about the screams once I get to the end of the chapter. It's how to kind of think about what sounds they were making, and how to recover that as an archive, right? And that is a more kind of, for him, imaginary or imaginative project that has no place in historical. Yeah, I mean.
What would he have wanted you to do with that?
Just tell the story, what's happening from that perspective. Just tell the story. I mean, I have hundreds of these records, right? So I could tell you how many women were beaten like this, and how many men were beaten like this, and where they were beaten. On every Monday, they were taken to the wharves in Kingston, and a line of enslaved people were whipped, like ritually, right? So, I mean, there's a lot I could tell social history-wise. I could tell, I could tell you what amelioration is. I can write about the acts they tried to pass to make slavery easier at this particular time period when they're ending the slave trade. I could talk about all these things, but it still leaves enslaved people in the abstract for me, right? And that was fine with him to leave enslaved people because they're not speaking, so you can't make up what they're thinking. But I'm not making. I'm just. If Captain Cook is looking at an enslaved woman, she's likely looking back, or she's likely having an experience in that room, right? And it's so writing the negative, right, like a photograph, right? Writing the negative to that space, and I think that it changes the story. It changes how we understand violence, and how we understand perspective, and all the things that obscure the perspective of the most vulnerable. So there was a lot of, I think, visceral pushback because it sounds to him like it's especially the last paragraph in this chapter. I use the word I. I reflect on the writing of the book in a different way than the epilogue, and I say, this is what this book is about. I've resisted the narrative of resistance, and this is why I've resisted all these things. But this book is about resistance in a particular way to that very pushback, right? And I think that bothered him too, because you're not supposed to put yourself in the book. And this is a conversation we have in women's and gender studies all the time, right? I'm listening to a student present, one of our students in WGS, and she wants to write and I don't really know, an autoethnography. Is that something? So is it a study of yourself in space? I clearly crossed the historical line. But I sat there thinking, how are you going to get a job? I did think that. I had this knee-jerk reaction. So here I am turning into one of them. No, I'm not. But I thought, that's your second book. And you know what? That's what they told me too when I tried to write this. That's your second book. This is not a tenure book. But I persisted, and she should too, right? But there are, when you get into the spiral of historical work, you start to kind of, you have an automatic kind of boundaries that start to come up with, well, what's permissible and what's, but for all those reasons, it does rub more traditionalist, or what I call fundamentalist historians, the wrong way.
But it doesn't allow for the new books coming into discipline.
Right.
And the disciplines have to change.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
Can you say, you spoke a little bit about Sally Hemington, the Every Woman, and for me it's kind of problematic because what you found in the archive and what we've seen in other work, the brutality. Sally Hemings has almost been turned into, like you say, a love story, as opposed to something that may have occurred a little bit outside the bounds of what was normal in Americans.
Right.
But why do you feel that that this kind of everyday brutality continues to be sanitized, and even in films that are being made today still tends to be sanitized?
Well, okay, so let me tell you something else I was told. In presenting the chapter with Molly, who was executed, it was execution records. There's pushback from many, many corners, and I think that it's hard to see this kind of violence. It's hard to sit with it, it's hard to listen to it, it's hard to take it in. And so there's a lot of just human resistance to it. I was told by another senior colleague, who's a friend of mine, that no one wants to read this. No one wants to sit with this violence because it's not showing us in the best frame. And this is coming off of 30 years, 40 years of histories written for resistance. We have humanity. Let us prove it to you. You know, slave revolts, resistance narratives. And so that it's hard then to then come back and say, well, actually, this was the majority experience. Sally Hemings is the exception, right? In many ways, she's an exceptional enslaved woman. So I had to push back on that and say, but many of us died and didn't survive. But there's a real kind of, I would say 1970s grounding in a kind of Black power narrative that then doesn't allow for vulnerability in particular ways. But on the other side of that, I think, I mean, saw 12 Years a Slave. I think for me, you know, people criticized it, but I actually thought, wow, he's actually dwelling on it. I mean, the whipping scene, but also, you know, when he's trying to keep himself from being hung. Like that, and everybody else was kind of just in the background playing, kids playing, and people going about their. That to me is what slavery was. It was that the violence was so everyday that it became mundane, and human response to that mundacity, right? Like that, you just kind of tune out in a particular way.
You know, if I can follow it,
Yes.
when you said that, when you went back to the Black Power era and those kind of things, you brought up two things. Mandingo, for one, I don't know if you've ever seen that film.
I've heard much about it.
Where they actually someone and boiled them.
Yeah.
But also in Sankofa,
Yeah.
how the Remus film,
Yeah.
which tried to get into, I think,
Yeah.
some of what you said, even more than 12 Years a Slave.
Mm-hmm. You know, in his film, Sankofa, like, I mean, I'm trying to think of a film made by a Black woman, Daughters of the Dust.
Yeah.
It's a different perspective because, it's, again, I think that those films are also about a kind of male heroism, on the other side of that, like utter victimization of enslaved women. Right? Those films really show that. Rather, it's a more complex story than that, and I do think that it matters to have a kind of a woman. A woman's perspective or Black feminist methods to kind of try to get at the masculinist representation of these things, right? And so, you know, I've kind of tried to work with that to kind of take the people that I'm finding in their fragmented ways seriously in a way that allows them to be complex, allows them to be anti-protagonists, if that's who they were, right? And allows for more complex relationships between enslaved people, because that's how we are, right? So, yeah, it's because the topic is so represented in pop culture, it just becomes. And wait, one more thing about what was that, Sankofa? He picks up the trope of the tragic mulatto with that character, right, that is confused and so again, I think we can unpack some of these representations as well. Yes?
So in the book, you kind of explore like the erasure of enslaved women's perspective throughout history. Do you think this continues in the stories, specifically stories of violence of people of color today?
Yes, and I forgot to mention that it's International Women's Day today. Right? So what an honor to be here and talking about women today. Yes, I mean, some of the same things that I feel like I was struggling with in this book about the law and about the powerlessness of enslaved people within this law, the slave law, the so-called slave law that is made up by slave owners to their own benefit. So what is that? It's not really a system if it's just for their benefit, and enslaved people have no voice. So I think that there's structures that are in place that don't allow for perspective. I mean, think about all of the kind of cases lately, the last couple of years of people being killed by the police, or black trans women being murdered. Like, that should be a meta-narrative, right? We don't have that. So the same kinds of things are at play, the same kinds of structural violence, political violence, the kind of narratives of who gets to be remembered in those kinds of cases, like they're all still at play. And I think what my work is trying to do is show that there's an origin of the processes of erasure, and that is the way that we do archival work, the disciplining structures that we are trained in, but also legal structures that were never meant for women or people of color to be empowered by. All of those forces are at play in the colonial era in the Caribbean, and the origins of slave systems. And so we can kind of deconstruct them in our own present in the same way. But they're absolutely present, and I think we need to, and that's why we're here, to think critically. I think one of the most important things about getting a college degree is to learn how to think critically and to analyze the media, and to know that you need to actually critically look at the media for the way that it represents people of color and women, and just be critical.
Well, we did kind of a midterm project. We had to visit plantations. So I was wondering, do you think plantations today have been erasing black narratives of what happened during slavery times?
It depends on what plantations. Typically, largely in the South, there's been books written about this, that there's always been a struggle to represent the enslaved experiences on these plantations. That there are kind of architectural tours. There's tours about the furniture and the grand living of the white slave owners. So there has been lots and lots of activism around trying to represent enslaved people. And I haven't yet been to the Whitney plantation outside of New Orleans, which is also very interesting. It's also very interesting because it's a retired lawyer, white guy who wants to represent enslaved people and especially children. There were a lot of children enslaved on that plantation, and he built, he redid this entire plantation from the perspective of enslaved people. Now I haven't been, so I haven't created a critique yet, but largely this has always been a fight. There's a project, it's a scholar or a journalist, a black man who is actually going around spending the night in slave cabins.
The slave dwelling.
Yes, right? All over the South. And that's another way to kind of think about bringing attention to these spaces, right? But if you go to them and ask them, why aren't you representing enslaved people? Because they built all of this. In the Caribbean, it's particularly egregious. The South is, okay. I'm in the South, I forget. I'm from New York. I'm not, yeah, now I am. But I think you could also be critical and ask them questions, right? It's up to us to ask them questions and what's missing. And as, you're a patron, you have that right. But I think it still happens a lot. Yeah.
Okay, so it seems like, so if we know that history is kind of written from the perspective of people in power, so they have the opportunity to try to tell the story how they want it to be. So if historians are taking these sources and viewing them in an objective way, it seems like a regurgitation of the person in power story. Mm-hmm. So if I'm viewing these sources and even the historians, I guess, interpretation or analyzation of these sources, how does that skew my view? And if I'm just trying to understand different perspectives, how does that affect you?
So what does it mean to read work that's not critical of the archive, that kind of just represents? It's painful. It's hard, and you know that it's not, you know that the voices that you want to hear aren't there. You want them to be there. So you ask, why aren't they there? And that starts the process of kind of pushing back on that representation. I mean, still to this day, I think people there's Caribbean historians invested in still writing that perspective and saying, yeah, it was violent, but it worked. That I've heard. I think that you have to, it's just it skews perspective. I mean, then you start to believe everything you read, right? And that, oh, enslaved people didn't push back, or, you know, some of the writing. Okay, let me give you an example, especially with enslaved women in this time period, who were talked about by planters that they were promiscuous. They weren't having children largely in this era, and this because it was sugar, and sugar was particularly hard on the body, right? So it caused infertility. And it caused infertility also, they weren't given enough calories to work the whole day, right? They weren't taken care of in prenatal care or any of that, right? And we know that the reason why they did not largely have children, or the children died at a young age, is because of the violence of that production, that they were enforced to work, right? But if you read the records, all of them say, you know, it's because they're promiscuous and they don't like children. And they want to position themselves always to have favor with the overseer and the master. And that they wanted to, they were promiscuous, they were the aggressors, sexually aggressor, right? If you reproduce that, that's immensely ignoring that there's violence going on, that these women were not empowered to do all the things that they were saying they were doing. And it gives you a really false idea that somehow, even in that system, enslaved women had this kind of inordinate amount of power. That's damaging, that's false, and that's fake news. To use that term, I can't believe I did say that. But it's, you know, you have to push back, you have to ask questions, because those representations are very damaging. Those, yeah. Thank you for that question.
Can I just say, so I have a question about, you had said at one point that, you know, you go through the material, it's really painful, you have to put it down and come back later. Could you just say a little briefly, say something about that process, about how did you do this research when you were immersed in all of this, you know, reading about violence, and then imagining, right, not just reading the archive, but then imagining the negative space. Like, how did you, how come you're not, you know, in a sanitarium?
How do you know I haven't been let out for that? So, have you heard me talk? You've heard me talk about this before. So in many ways, I mean, actually, when I first wrote what I read, the last chapter, I actually felt like I actually couldn't show anyone, because I was reproducing this violence, and I had to sit with, how do I write this without reproducing that? And that took a long, long time of sitting and thinking and rewriting and inhabiting, and it's hard on the body, it's hard on the psyche, it's hard on your emotions. I had a fellowship at the Schomburg Library in Harlem when I was writing, finishing. And I remember spending 8 hours a day when I was trying to get this last chapter done in these British Parliament debate records. And after 8 hours a day for like 10 days, like, I think I walked out at one point and there were a bunch of fellows in their offices, and someone said something to me and I snapped. I mean, I just yelled at them, and then I realized, oh, okay, this is actually seeped into me. and I'm disturbed and I'm distressed, right? So you have to take time to step away, and you have to take care of yourself, and you have to take walks and do all of that work. But when people say, well, how can you do this? And my next project is even grimmer, if it can be grimmer. There are people that, and I explain this as a trauma surgeon, there are people that are trauma surgeons and surgeons that recover burn victims, and there are people that are in aid workers in refugee camps all over the place. That's not what I do, but in a way I'm kind of a trauma surgeon in this regard. I can sit with this for long periods of time. But I understand also why people wrote about resistance for as long as they did. It's much easier to imagine and to understand that people fought back, and they did fight back. And I don't want to say that they didn't, right? But I do understand that there is a need to write from a place of hope. We need to have hope, right? So, yeah, I think that this is the work that I can do. And there's work that I can't do, right? So that's my process. And sitting there, yeah, thank you.
I'm actually gonna, I know that some of you all have to buy a book. You have other things to do, but I want to give you time to sign the book and get glad-handed, and you all will join me. And thank you.
Good to see you too. I know, right? We've been hanging out for the weekend, huh? I think he's going to see you today. Yeah, maybe. Oh, yeah. Here, right here, right now.
No. You can hang out. So for those that are interested in the books, they are here. After you get them signed, be sure to go pay for them.
Well, let's see what she says, because I may not know that.